But since having a mixed central bank wasn't enough, the central bank was nationalized in 1946. And from then until 1991, Argentina's average inflation rate was 240%. During that time, we had two hyperinflations, even without a war, and we removed 13 zeros from the currency. The widespread rejection of the currency led to what was the most successful stabilization program in Argentine history, convertibility. While average inflation was 9% between 1991 and 2001, it's true that this level of inflation was concentrated between 1991 and 1992. And from 1993 to 2001, Argentina was among the countries with the lowest inflation in the world. Later, when the state ran out of funding and defaulted, instead of trying to put its accounts in order, they decided to swindle us again. In fact, if you look at the banknotes we had at that time, they said convertible legal tender, but today they no longer do. They no longer have that slogan. In other words, they don't have the backing that those banknotes had. In other words, the political class swindled us again. But they told us that this time, it would be different, and it wasn't different at all. I'm going to round the numbers, just to warn you. Because later they're going to start with the number, the comma, I don't know what. I'm going to warn you beforehand that I'm going to round them. If I take the average inflation rate from the first period of the Kirchner regime, let's say, with Nestor Kirchner at the helm, the average inflation rate was 10%. In the second period of the Kirchner regime, that is, during Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's first term, inflation jumped to 20% on average. In the third period of the Kirchner regime, that is, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's second term, average inflation climbed to 30%. Perhaps in the document you published, you forgot to mention that perhaps one of your ways of combating inflation was to lie about it. I mean, it doesn't seem to us that the formula is to break the thermometer. The formula is to measure things. Or when they get so scared about the poor, where poverty is both reaching poverty and escaping poverty. It's not something that is generated instantly, it takes time. It demands genuine economic growth. In other words, it doesn't appear overnight just because, or disappear overnight just because. And among other things, because the poverty rate bothered them. They considered it a stigmatizing measure and decided not to publish it anymore. That's clear, that's easy, by drawing numbers. It must be much easier to achieve achievements and better show a government's performance. Well, that's not the approach we've decided to take. We've decided to tell the truth. Because we prefer to tell an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. So at least, madam, if you want to criticize, start with a self-criticism that is costing the country quite dearly. Which is because they lied about the numbers, or the disasters they caused, for example, with the YPF case, which will also cost all of us Argentines dearly. But not only that, during Macri's term, average inflation ended up climbing to an average of 40%. So, it's not just a question of inflation just now. What's more, Mr. Alberto Fernandez, the autocratic bruiser, basically left with inflation at 210%. But that doesn't reflect the dynamic he left behind, because as his administration progressed, Inflation continued to rise. And I remember when we had already won the elections and were finalizing details to get to the end of the term, during the first week of December, prices were growing at a daily rate of 1%. Put that in annual terms. The good thing is that I don't have to explain to you how a geometric function works, that is, you know how to calculate exponentials, and that annualized figure equals 3,700%. However, in the first 15 days of December, that is, during the second week of December, there was a sharper acceleration, and average inflation dropped to 1.2% daily. That means that, in reality, inflation had been traveling at 7,500% annually. And when you were calculating the various imbalances in the Argentine economy at the monetary level, I mean, because let's remember that we were facing what was going to be the worst crisis in Argentine economic history, because it combined a monetary surplus that was double what we had before the Rodrigazo, an experiment that involved explaining the inflation rate. Not only that, we also had a completely bankrupt central bank. It was in an even worse situation than Alfonsin's at the beginning of '89, which ended with a 5,000% hyperinflation in wholesalers. In addition, we had worse social indicators than those in 2001, so everything was set up for disaster. Furthermore, we had the equivalent of 4 monetary bases within the central bank, but in interest-bearing liabilities that generated endogenous money creation. We had $90 billion maturing in pesos, equivalent to $90 billion in pesos. We had $25 billion in foreign debt maturities, most of which were with the International Monetary Fund. But the program was in a slump because the previous government hadn't fulfilled any of its obligations. Therefore, we didn't create the inflation. It was generated by these 20-something years of savage populism. And the reality is that we describe the legacy, but we're not complaining about it, because let's be honest, under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, a libertarian liberal doesn't win the presidency. Therefore, we are clear that the conditions under which we were going to arrive were going to be on the verge of total collapse. In that sense, it was essential for us. Besides, my job description has 2 very clear points. On the one hand, the demand to end insecurity. This morning, Dr. Bullrich, my wonderful minister, was there. She's fighting the battle and, for example, has achieved the first month without homicides in Rosario, and the truth is that she's doing a truly exceptional job. So, that part of the job description is fantastic. And the other part says we have to eradicate inflation. So, as I was saying, wholesale inflation was running at 54% monthly, that is, at 17,000% annually. And that was feasible because what you needed was to validate the fiscal deficit, validate the quasi-fiscal deficit, or that it was due. The repos were due in 1 day. There was the problem of the puts. There was the problem of the debt in pesos. Therefore, everything was in place to validate that, plus the monetary surplus. And if you take the latest wholesale inflation data, it's around 3%. And if you take away from that 3%, which annualized is something like a little over 20%, what we call induced inflation, which has to do with the 2% crawling peg in international inflation, that gives you around 2.5%, leaving you with an annualized inflation rate of 6%. So, we're also fulfilling this part of the job description, despite the fact that they're kicking and screaming and some who made such a big mistake refuse to admit it. So, beyond this, the point is how we got here. And now, let's say I'm going to give a brief introduction to monetary theory. I hope, Chris, take note of it, take out your notebook and pencil, and write it down. Those next to you aren't going to help you at all, because they're the ones who caused this disaster. Basically, to make a diagnosis, you need a solid theoretical framework. You need to understand what you're talking about. Because if you don't understand what you're talking about, betting on the type 2 error isn't something that consistently works. A type 1 error is doing everything right and having it go wrong. A type 2 error is doing everything wrong and having it go right. And it's clear that theory won hands down over the establishment when it comes to the idea that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Now, to understand the nature of inflation, inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, it's a clearly different definition from the generalized rise in prices. Because if for you inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money, it means there's a problem of excess supply of money, and the problem lies with the central bank. If you believe that the generalized rise in prices is going to be blamed on price setters, then you're going to implement price controls, a tool that we've had evidence of not working for 4,000 years. So, we have to understand the nature of money, because clearly, I apologize for having to explain this, but clearly, even the obvious must be explained. The colossus here, Federico Sturzenegger, will know this, and what you had to deal with the cast. Look, I thought that before believing the central bank should be eliminated, I believed there could be a central bank, especially when, without a doubt, one of the most talented economists in the world was in charge of the central bank, with a truly exceptional group. After what I saw them do to him, I lost all hope and decided that the best thing that could happen is to not have a central bank. But I'm going to explain that now, too. In that sense, what one would have to explain is where the existence of money comes from. So, what the economy is like when there's no money, well, it's a barter economy, that is, goods are exchanged for goods. Now, if you have a barter economy, you basically have two problems. One is the problem of double coincidence. That is, you have to find someone who wants the good you have to sell, but at the same time, that person has to want the good you have, which obviously poses a huge problem that causes a lot of transactions to be lost, which creates a huge problem. And the other problem is that of indivisibility, because it may be that I want to eat bread and the baker on the corner wants a talk on economics. But the problem is how much per kilo of bread. Obviously, because the ones that, let's say, before I became president, were a few kilos that I couldn't eat. So, that raises a problem of indivisibility. That is, because, let's say, perhaps what I would give for a kilo of bread at the conference is of no use to me. Now, the issue is that the human being, faced with that situation, didn't start crying, and he didn't call, "I want Daddy's state." He didn't call the state either. What did he do? He found a way around it, he resolved it, he looked for a way around it, and he fixed it somehow. And one of the things that human beings discovered was that there were goods that were exchanged more than others. So they began to buy those goods that were exchanged much more and used them as a mechanism of indirect exchange. Then, suddenly, they bought that good, and with that good, they later bought whatever they wanted. That is, that's where money comes in. An indirect exchange good is a good used to make transactions. That's money. So, given this situation, different types of indirect exchange goods appeared throughout history, serving as money. The first of all was livestock. And why was it livestock? Because humans were nomadic. And so they traveled with their own food, that is, with livestock. So it was something they exchanged regularly. And then they used it as an indirect exchange good, and livestock was money. Now, later, humans became sedentary, and when they became sedentary, one of the things they ate most extensively, so to speak, was bread. So they noticed that many transactions were made in wheat. So later, wheat became currency. So, we have different types of currency. We have, for example, flax, coffee, tobacco. What's more, there's a very funny quote from Milton Friedman about hyperinflation in Germany, and he says that nails were used as money, or whiskey, no, sorry, cognac. So, he said it was the most liquid definition of money he'd ever encountered. What's more, if you look at movies from prisons from many years ago, what was the money? Cigarettes. What did the prisoners ask for? They asked for cigarettes, but suddenly they started smoking. No, they used them for exchange within the prison. Now, what's the problem with this type of asset? It doesn't serve as a store of value. I mean, what happened with this type of asset is that it degraded. So, it's like having, Chris notes that he gave you another lesson, it's like having a negative interest rate, it's like ice cream. You have ice cream, and as time goes by, it's worth less. That's a negative interest rate, and in fact, what you need to understand is that it can't tell you the price of money, madam, because the interest rate exists independently of the existence of money. The interest rate exists because time exists. The interest rate has to do with the mechanism of passing consumption over time. That is, what is savings? Future consumption. It's a way of passing consumption over time. So, those who go into debt are those who advance consumption, and those who lose are those who defer consumption. And that's even independent of the central bank. The interest rate has to do with the relative price of present goods compared to future goods. It has nothing to do with the monetary issue. It exists because time exists. If not, there would be no interest rate, it would be an inexplicable monstrosity, like the one Keynes made in his general theory. A mistake we've been carrying with us for a long time. But then, in an attempt to preserve value, they switched to metallic coins. And so gold, silver, and bronze appeared. Gold was used for large transactions, silver was used for smaller transactions. Probably the best-known silver coin was the taler, which is the dollar today. And in that sense, there was another problem, which was the problem of portability. So, I used the example of Zorro to illustrate the problem graphically. Then they started with the story of Zorro. The version of I don't know what, I don't know. I talked about the version I saw, let's say, on television from Guy Williams, the other versions, I mean. So, what I said was that, strictly speaking, I loved that version of Zorro because he's a true anarcho-capitalist. Because what did Zorro do? He fought against the criminals who robbed the merchants and he fought against the soldiers. This is very interesting because this is what surprises me, because instead of capturing the abstraction, they focus on the fine print. Well, that's why we are where we are. Or maybe all this tinting did him harm, it clouded his thinking. No, but Christina wasn't talking. That said, what was happening? If you were going to trade, what were you going to do? either with goods or with gold. So, it's like you were wearing a sign on your forehead that said, "I have gold, come rob me, come rob me." And what did the criminals do? They were going to try to intercept those carts, because it was a prison without an archer. There was gold there. And in that sense, what's interesting? That Zorro was fighting against those criminals. Why? Because if they didn't reach the city with the goods, then they had a capital loss. They would eat into the effect of the gold coins at that moment. They would eat into it with a higher price level expressed in gold. And in that sense, what would happen is that no one would bring them goods again. So, it's as if they had closed the economy, resulting in a huge loss of well-being. So Zorro was also a social benefactor because, let's say, he protected the roads so that thieves wouldn't steal from merchants, so he was also a supporter of free trade. A very liberal man, but on top of that, he fought against Monasterio and others, which meant he was fighting against the authorities. He fought over the issue of tax payments, so Zorro was an anarcho-capitalist, no doubt about it. I mean, it could also be an anarcho-capitalist to be at the head of the state and be like the state mole who comes to break it. Or what do you think it means to have reduced public spending by 30%? It was only after the war, and there aren't any such great experiences. That said, what appeared then? Paper money. So, you left the cash, you left it somewhere, and in exchange, you gave him a certificate, then you went and paid with that certificate. Obviously, there were those who acted smart and issued certificates without the gold or silver behind them. Well, obviously, it ended with a couple of revolts, but what did the state do? It said, "No, well, now I'll do it," and that's where they ruined our currency. So, that's where society's problems begin. And central banks are a relatively new invention. But here's the important thing. Back again, we'll now move on to underline this, ma'am, money is an indirect exchange good. I mean, the fact that the course of history has turned it into a piece of paper that's falsified by the world's central banks is another problem. That's the great scam in the history of humanity. Called the central bank, but money is an indirect exchange good. And why is it so important to emphasize that it's an indirect exchange good? Because if it's an indirect exchange good, it means it's a derived demand. I mean, let's see, guys, who among you is thinking of hoarding what currency to take, let's say, to the wooden suit? I mean, you'd have to be pretty stupid. On the other side, you don't buy anything. You only buy here, in the fiction that is the visualization you make. Or have any of you ever stopped to think that the amount of ink on the $1 bill, the $2 bill, the $5 bill, the $10 bill, the $20 bill, the $50 bill, the $100 bill, and the $100 bill is the same? The only thing that changes are the drawings, that is, the heroes and the numbers, but there you are making a mental representation of that. So, what you have to understand is that, at its core, the demand for money is a derivative demand for money. Why do you demand money? To demand goods. You don't eat money, you don't eat it. Take out a bill now, try eating it, it doesn't work. In fact, you'll probably get sick. So, at its core, the demand for money is a derived demand. It's a mirror demand of the demand for goods. And this is interesting because if it's a mirror of the demand for goods, all the macroeconomics books that state that the demand for money is a function of income and the interest rate are horrendous. In reality, the demand for money depends on consumption. And obviously it depends on the intertemporal path of consumption. And if I want to figure out, let's say, what it depends on, why don't I need to include income? Because if I'm building a general equilibrium system, my income comes from the sale of leisure time in the labor market and comes from my share of company profits. Therefore, I don't have to include income. That's an aberration. That's a stupid thing Keynes did to be able to invent the quantity adjustment effect and, above all, invent the Keynesian multiplier, which is violating the budget constraint. Of course, by violating the budget constraint, of course, if you finance it with monetary issuance, it generates inflation. Madam, it does generate inflation. If you finance the fiscal deficit with monetary issuance, it generates inflation. I mean, in other countries that have deficits, they finance it with interest-bearing debt, that is, not the central banks. Now, then, this means that if my money demand function now depends on my intertemporal consumption path, I have to know what consumption demand comes from. When you pose an exercise, you go, take a microbook, and when you look at the general equilibrium excess demand functions or the demand functions for a good, what does it depend on? It depends on all the prices in the economy. That is, income doesn't appear, all the prices in the economy appear. And at the same time, if that economy is intertemporal, it includes today's prices, tomorrow's prices, and so on. There's no need to include the interest rate. The interest rate is implicit in the vectors, in the part of the price vector that contains future prices. Therefore, the demand for money depends on consumption. And this is very interesting because, ultimately, what does the demand for money depend on? That it depends on consumption. That it depends on those prices. All of that is derived from where? From what Robert Lucas Jr., may he rest in peace, called the deep parameters. And what are the deep parameters? The utility function, that is, preferences, technology, endowments, and the type of economy I have, if it's a private property economy, let's say. But therefore, all those parameters are given. Therefore, under normal conditions, without someone shaking up the economy, issuing money like a pig, the consumption path would be determined by these parameters, which are deep parameters and are given. Therefore, the classicists weren't so foolish when they believed that the demand for money was something granite. Yes, of course. Under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, it's something granite. In other words, if preferences don't change, technology doesn't change, endowments don't change, and that vector of intertemporal consumption doesn't change. Therefore, if the demand for money is a granite structure, the real demand for money must equal what? The real supply of money. Did you see Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay, however you want to call him, calling photographers and saying, "Get ready. The knockout is coming"? Take the picture because another knockout is coming for Mrs. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. If the demand for money is a granite structure, which is the real demand for money, this must equal real balances. Real balances are the nominal amount of money relative to the price level. Therefore, the price level will be determined by the amount of money supplied by the central bank relative to the demand for money, which is this real demand for money. Therefore, when the central bank issues money, all it does is change the nominal scale, that is, prices rise. Take note, ma'am. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess supply of money, either because money is issued or because the demand for money falls, or both. What's more, I'll tell you more. If you've already managed to lift it, you've already counted 8, come on, I'll give you another piece of my mind. In this context, when you have this situation, a loss of the purchasing power of money occurs. This means that all prices expressed in monetary units rise, and the dollar is just another price in the economy. What happens, take note again, is something called the Hume-Cantillon effect, which has to do with which prices rise first and which ones come last. So, for example, if you had a situation of falling demand for money, that situation, let's say, okay, you don't demand domestic money, what are you going to demand? Well, in principle, you go and demand dollars. That is, you make a portfolio change, then the price of the dollar jumps. Why? Because it's a financial asset, it adjusts quickly. Now, once that happens, the price of tradable goods rises. Then wholesale prices rise, then retail prices, and finally, wages. That's why, when you have an event of this nature, it destroys workers. In other words, it creates a tremendous problem. It has to do with a case of falling demand for money. That is, it's not that the dollar causes prices to rise. No, it's an early indicator in a scenario of this nature. Furthermore, it can't always do that, because in reality, what may have happened is that you increase the money supply, then fuel the demand for goods, then the price of what would be retail prices rises. As that puts pressure on wholesalers, then puts pressure on wages, and since the numbers don't add up later if it's not competitive, the exchange rate jumps. You realize that everything depends on where the excess supply was generated. Madam, it's nonsense to say that the exchange rate is what determines the rest of the prices. But I'll explain it more later. Therefore, we, working seriously with general equilibrium, unlike those econo-chantists who claim to do general equilibrium and can't solve a Lagrangian, and even less so intertemporal cases, our diagnosis was and is and will continue to be that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon generated by excess supply. Either because supply increases or demand falls, or both happen at the same time. Therefore, faced with the disastrous scenario we had, that we were headed for 17,000% inflation, which would have meant a monstrous drop in GDP, and the number of poor people would have been monstrous as well. We would have reached more than 90% poverty and more than 50% destitute. In other words, we would have replicated the case of Venezuela without a doubt. So, our first fundamental idea was to end inflation, to attack inflation. I mentioned during the campaign that, in addition to the monetary policy, it has a lag of 18 to 24 months. I say this because it sounds like I'm speaking, I don't know, in Sanskrit. You're all in a hurry, and it's only been 9 months. Go and see my files, not the edited ones, see the complete ones. Not the ones that the dirty journalists with envelopes, not all of them, but a large part, edit to distort information and lie. So, go and see the original videos, they're there. So, the issue was to curb the issuance of money, how to curb the issuance of money. So, one of the sources of issuance was the financing of the fiscal deficit. When we arrived, the consolidated fiscal deficit between the Treasury and the National Treasury was 15 points of GDP. 5 of which were in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank. Therefore, the task facing the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, and I have the honor of having the giants of Pablo Cournot and Vladimir Werning here. Let's say they have been great architects of solving this problem, was to attack those two sources of money creation. So, what we proposed was a zero deficit. I remember that during the campaign, I was carrying a chainsaw, and people told me I was crazy because I was carrying a chainsaw. In fact, we had fallen through the agreement with the International Monetary Fund, which posed an enormous challenge to resolving the failed agreement. And in that context, we decided to go to the fund and present a zero deficit plan. The fund was satisfied with us meeting the goals of the previous government, which, madam, you may criticize, but you were also part of it. So, in that sense, we had proposed a zero deficit. Obviously, just as during the campaign they said it was impossible and that we were delusional, and I don't know what else. The fund would have been enough to fulfill the program that had collapsed due to the disaster of the previous government. We proposed a zero deficit. It seemed very ambitious because it implied a 5-point GDP adjustment in the Treasury. And despite the fact that for 113 of the last 123 years of history, we had a fiscal deficit, only in the 10 years that we didn't have one were we in default. It was the first time in these last 123 years that we reached a zero deficit, but we didn't do it. It wasn't in a year. We achieved it in the first month of my administration. Now that's quite a management. Obviously, all those who said it was impossible to do this, those who repeatedly failed throughout history and who should remain silent, because they are part of the damage and destruction that Argentines caused, should have a little more humility, or at least self-criticism. So, what happened? We ended up adjusting public spending by more than 30%. Then they started saying it was because we weren't paying, because we were fudging the numbers. They said all sorts of things, the same things the lady here is saying. Those comments are long overdue. They were already making those comments in January, February, March. Today, no one raises those arguments that belittle the work we've done. And it's clearly understood today that this is a monetary policy rule that's here to stay, and that I'll soon go to Congress to present the budget based on the zero deficit law. And that meant we stopped issuing currency to finance the Treasury. Now, the quasi-fiscal debt was generated endogenously, which had to do with the repayment of the central bank's interest-bearing liabilities, and which generated a 10-point fiscal deficit. A quasi-fiscal deficit. In that sense, we had to end the endogenous issuance, as we showed a positive fiscal result and accumulated financial surpluses. This giant here, Mr. Pablo Cournot, was able to begin to restructure the peso curve. By restructuring the peso curve, he allowed us to take out the debt that was in the central bank and transfer it to the Treasury. Because, at its core, it was always Treasury debt. Because, for example, what was Kirchnerism doing? It issued money with a fixed exchange rate, losing reserves. Madam, you took over the country with $52 billion in reserves and destroyed it. How many did you give to Federico? Net minus $5,000, a marvel, madam, huh? But aside from that, the problem with the dollar futures, which was about $25 billion, and in that context, of course, when you issue with a fixed exchange rate, one of the things that happens is you lose reserves. And what were you doing? You placed bonds with the central bank. You've placed more than $100 billion in bonds with the central bank, a real scam. And that's how they took out the dollars. So in fact, one of the things the central bank did recently was recognize the capital loss generated by the previous government, a whopping $45 billion, for example. Not only that, but when we started doing this, no one believed we could fix the quasi-fiscal problem. Madam, at one point you complained that the real interest rate was negative. I'll tell you that if we had listened to the Eco-No chant who proposed putting the real interest rate in positive terms instead of having 4 remunerated bases relative to the existing one, today we would have 8 or 9, 10, the carry trade. Today, the carry trade would be a discussion, and we would clearly be on the verge of hyperinflation. But we did something else. I tell you to send the idiots next to you to study, because you know what we did. We arbitraged the dollar rate with the peso rate, obviously corrected for risk. And that meant that, given then the devaluation, madam, was already there. I mean, just because you sweep the data under the rug doesn't mean the devaluation was there. The ratio between the parallel dollar and the official dollar was close to 3-to-1. In fact, when we took over, the parallel dollar was around 1,300. Today it's at 1,240. Oh, how the baboons suffer. Never mind, there's a flourishing business called producing Vaseline for serially blundering economists. And even though no one said how to fix it, or that it was impossible, or that they proposed expropriations, we and these two giants here, Pablo and Vladimir, have made the quasi-fiscal deficit zero. What seemed impossible, we did in 7 months. In other words, in 1 month we achieved the miracle of a zero deficit, and in 7 months we achieved the miracle of ending the quasi-fiscal deficit. What a piece of management, gentlemen. However, this wasn't the only bombshell the previous government had left us. They had also left us with the problem of the put bonds. The previous government was running a fiscal deficit, and the International Monetary Fund decided to turn a blind eye to it. And since the banks didn't want to finance the Treasury, preferring to do so through the central bank, the put bonds appeared. But of course, accounting-wise, put bonds only apply to contingent liabilities, not contingencies. But of course, in a scenario of macroeconomic debacle, that was in the money. And obviously, when we announced the part of the monetary program that involves zero excess demand, that is, issuance for the Treasury would stop, issuance for interest-bearing liabilities would stop. And we were going to move to a phase in which issuance would only be for the external sector. And we were sitting at the table with the banks discussing the issue of the put bonds. Banco Macro came and executed the equivalent of $2 billion on us. I mean, I want to know how many times in your life you've seen Argentina attacked for the equivalent of $2 billion in 1 day and the economy held up. Another miracle. In other words, there's more strength in the sky than we think. In that sense, we were also able to navigate the issue of puts, and faced with the possibility of another run and macro instability. With Minister Caputo, who will be remembered in textbooks as the best economy minister in history, we decided, also in a conference with Santiago Basile, to move to a deeper stage of monetary policy, which is to move to a zero-emission regime. Basically, the problem was that we, following the textbooks, believed that the purchase of dollars was linked to the demand for money and, therefore, if the demand for money was linked to the supply, that doesn't generate inflation. However, one of the things that wasn't in the textbooks and that we discovered is that, of course, with capital controls, that's not necessarily true. What's going on? When you have free movement of capital, and if you want to transact in pesos, you go with your dollars and buy pesos from the central bank, and with those pesos, you have a real transaction underway. Therefore, in that case, there is a demand for money, and therefore, it doesn't generate inflation. The problem is that when you have currency controls, which we have basically to fix the stock problem left to us by the previous government, that is to say, ma'am, I haven't stopped being a libertarian liberal. The thing is, I'm a libertarian liberal, not a libertarian liberal. So I also understand the economy as problems of stocks and flows. So, if you had 4 one-day monetary bases, if you had 90 maturities in pesos for the equivalent of $90 billion, if you had $50 billion of debt in the SIRA, and it's as if you didn't defuse that bomb, it wouldn't end well, it would end quite badly. I understand that's what the previous government wanted, for us to act like libertarians, for everything to go up in flames, and then by January, after the supermarket looting and other Peronist rhetoric, they could return and definitively kill any semblance of freedom. In that sense, we do serious economics. That is, we don't just do textbook economics. So, in fact, what happened regarding the interest rate is a great triumph we've also had in terms of economic theory, because what did the econochantist tell us? That we had to raise the interest rate. If we had raised the interest rate, the central bank's balance sheet would have exploded. Thus, having jumped the exchange rate to a level similar to the parallel exchange rate corrected by the country tax, in that context, what happened? The interest rate in dollars was arbitraged with the peso rate, but the peso rate meant it was negative in real terms, and that also allowed us to dilute the stock of repos. So you can learn, ma'am, that monetary theory isn't just a matter of looking at flows, it also looks at stocks. And sometimes the stock problem is much bigger than one imagines, because it actually generated a quasi-fiscal deficit that was twice the fiscal deficit. In that sense, we decided to go for something more radical. Because what's happening? When you have capital controls, which we need to have until we finish fixing the stock problems and until we finish cleaning up the money overhang. The money overhang will disappear when inflation is zero, induced inflation being, macroeconomic inflation is zero. You have observed inflation and induced inflation. Macroeconomic inflation is the one in between, that is, it's that residual. Today, at the wholesale level, it's 0.5, at the consumer level, it's 1.5, and it's on the way to disappearing. In that context, what happens? When you have capital controls, exporters are required to settle in the MULC, Mexican Central Bank of the Autonomous Community of Mexico. And what's the problem with that? That exporter isn't necessarily buying pesos. What we do know is that they're selling dollars. Note that when the currency controls and capital controls are in place, wanting to buy pesos isn't the same as having to sell dollars. That difference is fundamental, because then, those dollars weren't coming in because they wanted pesos. Those dollars are coming in because there's a regulation that imposes it. So, that generated an expansion of the money supply beyond demand. And that's why inflation persists. Not because there are indexation mechanisms, because there's inflationary inertia, but because more was issued than was demanded. So, to correct this, we move to a deeper phase of the program, which is zero issuance. And it's not intervention, because the net intervention level falls. Because if I'm liquidated $3, so to speak, and I issue $3, my intervention level is $3. Now, if I have a gap and I return dollars so that the pesos remain constant, suppose with the $30 gap, I have $1 left in the central bank and I return $2 to the market, I'm not intervening. I'm keeping the money supply constant. Or what other way can you think of? What do you want, for me to sterilize them and start paying interest again? Another big fat deposit? So, if you look closely, intervention went from $3 to $1. Therefore, in this equilibrium, there's less intervention, and it's much more like a free market equilibrium than an intervention equilibrium. Why? Because when there's no intervention, what would zero intervention be? The exchange rate variation is free. The money supply variation is zero, and the reserve variation is zero. There's another issue. Hey, if the central bank doesn't buy dollars, does it default? Could it be that we're so stupid as to say such outrageous things? I understand why the doctor says this because she's not an economist. She's supposedly a lawyer, but she doesn't show her degree either. But let's suppose she were a lawyer. It seems she doesn't know that. It's not part of her training. I say, how could you come up with this delusion that the debt has to be paid with dollars bought by the central bank on the market? I mean, what you're saying with that is that you're going to issue pesos to buy dollars, and then the state, the treasury, will come and grab your dollars, give you back public bonds, with which it's swindling you again, and it's swindling you with its own seigniorage. If you want, I mean, a more rudimentary version, easier to understand, although incorrect, the inflationary tax. So, what are you telling me? Do I have to annihilate Argentines with inflation to pay the debt? No, guys, the debt is paid with a fiscal surplus. Not like some idiot buying dollars on the market by issuing pesos. All that does is generate inflation. So, the dollars to pay the debt are bought with the fiscal surplus, which is what we're doing. Next, I want to address the discussion of endogenous money, because it's incredible. The lady says that the exchange rate is what determines inflation or prices, or if you prefer, devaluation determines inflation. Basically, I'm telling you that this is applying PPP, purchasing power parity, and saying that the domestic price is the international price times the exchange rate. I'll tell you, madam, that this is consistent with the quantitative theory. In fact, you know what? That was done by a man named David Hume, who later took it up with Adam Smith and the classics. Therefore, far from being impossible to consider, in fact, if the domestic price level is determined at the monetary level by the money supply divided by the real demand for money, the same will apply worldwide. The exchange rate, which is given by the local price divided by the international price, is determined by what are called relative monetary conditions. Let me do the math for you. Local supply divided by international supply, international demand divided by local demand. So, given the conditions in the world that are right for us, If the quantity of money rises or the demand for money falls, that impacts prices, but it also impacts the exchange rate. I mean, do you realize that there's no consistency in what you're saying? It's also interesting to discuss that model, isn't it? Because, ultimately, what is it saying? Well, the problem of inflation is the lack of dollars. Total nonsense. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Of course, they start from this idea that local prices are the exchange rate multiplied by the international rate, and that the exchange rate is determined by excess demand for foreign currency. So, what is the solution? Is it to export more? I mean, more excess demand for goods? It's strange. What's the other solution? Default, restructuring. Are those the solutions you propose to lower inflation? They seem quite comical. Do you know why? Because they did all of those. And then, nothing happens. They cite external restrictions. Another stupidity the size of a house. How does the external restriction model work? You stimulate demand, you make GDP grow, that makes imports increase, and if they can't be financed, then you have a limit to GDP expansion due to external restrictions. Do you know why that happens? Because there is a fixed price. Leave the price flexible, and the external restriction disappears. The external restriction exists in a fixed price model. If you free prices, there is no external restriction. And fixed prices, setting the exchange rate with a fiscal deficit. And issuing reserves was what caused all the reserves to slip and destroy them. Today, if things had been done reasonably, Argentina should have had around $120 to $150 billion in reserves. And we don't have them precisely because of Kirchnerism's monetary populism, because of these atrocities. So, it's also interesting because it says, no, the problem isn't fiscal, because there's a hypothesis that maintains that the problem is fiscal, because I have a fiscal deficit, I finance it with monetary issuance. And that's what generates inflation. It says, it has nothing to do with the fiscal deficit. It's funny because it then says the problem is the excess demand for foreign currency that generates my debt. And where did the debt come from? From a cabbage? Debt is a product of the fiscal deficit, ma'am. It's called a budget restriction. Try to see what happens to you when you spend more than you earn. You go into debt. And that pays interest. That started because you went into debt. And who went into debt for $450 billion? The previous governments. I'll tell you something. We reduced the debt. So we're doing our job. So, there's also a contradiction in terms. But of course, they believe that prices are generated by a markup on costs, that is, the theory of value. The objective theory of value. In other words, they went back to before 1871. Let me tell you something. I read Menger and I'm proud to be Austrian. In that sense, it's clear why they've caused us so much harm and continue to cause so much harm. And it's interesting because this kind of stupidity isn't just thought up by Kirchnerism. There are many more people who think along these lines. And these things are what caused Argentina, from being the richest country in the world, to fall to the middle of the table. Starting out as the richest country in the world, over the last 50 years we've multiplied poverty at least tenfold. That is, in a country that produces food for 500 million people and the treasury takes 70%, that is, the food of 350 million people, there are 5 million Argentines who don't have enough to eat. That's the disaster they created. It was created by the entire political class, not us, who came to clean up all this mess. And I'll give you one more fact. Why do they say, no, the drop in GDP? The drop in GDP. It's very interesting. If you consider the drop in GDP in the first quarter, which is when we implemented the bulk of the adjustment, in fact, we overreacted to the adjustment. GDP in the first quarter fell 5%. I remind you that, when Peronism was in power in 2002, with an agreement with a man named Alfonsin, they took out de la Rua. And in that context, it's very interesting because they made a much smaller adjustment, and GDP in the second quarter of the year, when they made the adjustment, fell 16%. So, 5% is quite remarkable, compared to the fact that we made a much larger adjustment. But I'll tell you something, in the last quarter of last year, GDP had already fallen 2.5%. And when you look at the seasonally adjusted GDP for the first quarter, it fell 2.6%. So, it wasn't so alarming. And I'll tell you more. The other day I was having dinner with Professor de Pablo, and he pointed out something I hadn't noticed. If you take the EMAE, which is the proxy for GDP in the monthly version, if you take it seasonally adjusted and take the last observation against December, GDP fell 2%. So, not only are we making the largest adjustment in history, we're lowering inflation. But activity also didn't fall that much. I understand. This is very painful for the political class. We're showing them that they're useless and good for nothing, that all they do is harm, and that removing the state from the mix is beneficial, not harmful. It improves our quality of life. Not only because of the freedom we gain, but also because we're more productive and efficient. But they also predicted that we were going to have a social catastrophe, a catastrophe we didn't have. Why? Because from the Ministry of Human Capital, while we were making adjustments to items that really hurt the political system, today, if you take the Universal Child Allowance plus the food card, 99% of the basic food basket is covered, when the previous government left it at around 60%. Therefore, our social policy is also much better. But I'll give you a fact that isn't included in that correction. When Minister Petovello decided to remove the compensation from social programs, everyone cried out, saying, "Oh, well, now you're encouraging vagrancy." No, they didn't realize what we were doing. Look, what we were doing was very simple. When you delivered a social program, even though there was a card with which you collected payments, you then had to go and account for the compensation and have it signed. And that's where the bribery came in. That's where the managers of poverty appeared. Everyone was full of talk about how we had to put an end to the managers of poverty. We're the ones who put an end to the managers of poverty. And that was achieved in a battle from the first day, when Minister Bullrich took control of the streets, when Minister Petovello put an end to this scheme. Because look how interesting it is. Because now, if you cut off the money, you wouldn't get paid and you weren't obligated to go to the marches, because you didn't have to go and give the compensation, which, in essence, the compensation is that you go to the marches and cause trouble. So, of course, when we announced that the compensation was ending, a few days later Bellaboni announced a strike. Of course, because we were cutting off the mechanism by which they stole half the money from the beneficiaries of social programs. And at that time, he said 50,000 people would go. because he thought 100,000 would go, and that's how he presented it as a success. And the truth is, only 3,000 ended up going. There were more police officers than people. And that allowed us to win the streets. And, in addition, you have three types of war. The war that is stocks against stocks, the one who runs out of bullets first loses, so to speak. There's one that's flow, that is, it's a mess because it never ends. But there's another that's stock and flow. The war that the pickets and all this social unrest posed to us was flow. And the state itself was providing the money to those who were breaking things. And what did they say? That it was impossible to end the pickets. What did we do? We cut that cable. And it was a battle of flows, the state versus the picketers' stocks. They ran out of stocks and the pickets ended. 4 months ago, what seemed impossible, we've gone 4 months without pickets. We're really managing. Finally, getting to the future monetary policy and the return of the currency controls, the first thing you have to understand is that I can't set dates. I understand that your brains are damaged by years of collectivism, but has it occurred to any of you to demand that the central bank know, a year from now, where the interest rate will be? I mean, they're asking us for things. They just need to tell us what the exchange rate will be tomorrow at such a time, let's say such a minute. In other words, it's crazy. In other words, one advances by objectives, and the point is that these achievements depend on the decisions of individuals. Therefore, it's endogenous. I mean, when, let's say, were we able to put an end to interest-bearing liabilities? And when individuals wanted to switch to treasury debt? That said, we have the broad monetary base and we have the observed, traditional monetary base. So, to the extent that the traditional monetary base, as a result of the increased demand for money, leads to the unwinding of remunerated positions, you'll not only have a situation where the two bases are mapped, but the flip side of that is that money overhang has been eliminated, and inflation is zero. When I talk about zero inflation, I'm referring to the difference between observed and induced inflation. When we get there, the only inflation that will remain is observed inflation equal to induced inflation. And then we can open the door and we won't need dollars because the demand for money is matched to the supply of money. Why is this important? First, look at this because it's very important. Economic activity, despite what you've been told, is recovering, and it's recovering at a very significant rate. And that naturally leads to an increase in the demand for money. What's happening with this increase in demand for money? You have to understand this. Companies need to generate working capital. And if they need working capital, what are they going to do? Are they going to go into debt or are they going to leave the money market? When they leave the money market to demand working capital, which is a demand for money, what do you start to dismantle? The remunerated positions in banks, and that's why banks exit their remunerated positions. And what are they asking for? Cash. So, this is causing the demand for money to shift from the traditional monetary base to the broad monetary base. So, what's the big risk? We've left the money supply constant, and the demand for money is growing. Obviously, what's happening in the middle is also that the money overhang is being cleared, and you're going to have less and less inflation. Once we reach that point, what's the problem now? The monetary base coincided with the broad monetary base. Now the demand for money can continue to grow, and the supply of pesos no longer grows. In that case, what's the risk? The risk is that there will be deflation, and the problem lies in the fact that, since the speed of adjustment in the financial markets is faster than in the real market, your exchange rate will fall sharply, leading to corporate bankruptcy and a slowdown in economic growth. What did we say about this? Currency competition. Why do we talk about currency competition? Suppose the two currencies were just the peso and the dollar. You can, and in fact you can do it today. Which is why the case of Diarco, who accepts payment in dollars, is so wonderful. So, what are you automatically generating? You don't have to be throwing dollars into the market and generating a brutal appreciation. You start making transactions in dollars. The monetization of the economy will be done by individuals, as always, and they will do it by investing dollars and making transactions in dollars. And what's interesting about this? The number of pesos will remain fixed. They will have a market exchange rate that won't experience a jump because supply and demand for dollars are mapped, and as there is more economic growth, there will be more and more dollars relative to pesos. And at some point, the number of dollars will be so greater than the number of pesos that we will be able to close the central bank. And thus the cancer of Argentine inflation will be permanently eradicated. Thank you very much.